Hey guys, welcome to TypeCrits, the series where we critique the world's big typography changes. Today I want to talk about the big Apple refresh, a kind of historical marker now that really shaped, I think, the entire trajectory of what Apple had to do because of this typographic change. It started with Apple's choice to adopt a typeface called ITC Garamond. ITC Garamond was kind of the worst typeface. It was called Garamond, but it was not really a Garamond. And it didn't look very nice, and people just kind of avoided it, and no one really used it. And Apple saw that and understood branding in a certain way. And they knew that if they picked up ITC Garamond, they would be the only ones using ITC Garamond. And they could build their identity on that. And there would be no competition in terms of other people being mixed up with ITC Garamond. There was none of that. Nobody was using it. And so it would be entirely Apple's font. And so they adopted it, and it looked terrible. And they tried to make it look better, but it looked pretty terrible. But pretty quickly, people began to look at that typeface and say, "Oh, that's Apple." And that kind of recognition was gold for Apple. That's exactly what Apple wanted. They wanted to be unique, they wanted to be different, and they wanted to be recognized. And they got all of that with ITC Garamond. When Apple was called Apple Computers, their entire ecosystem was built, from the lettering that was on the devices, on the computers, to the lettering that was on the packaging, the typography that was on the packaging. Everything was ITC Garamond, and that was a real deliberate typographic choice. For those of you who are new to this world and don't really know how that can be so meaningful, there's this thing with fonts where it kind of resonates in this subconscious way over you, and you recognize it and you associate it with things. Brands use this as a tool to make their products and services very memorable subconsciously. So they'll pick a typeface and maybe customize the typeface a little bit, change it a little bit, and make it their own, and then build an association between it and its products and services. And that association is maybe in terms of visual design the most important thing. I mean, there's color, there's motion, there's grids, but typography and type choices just seem to have such a big impact on people's memories that they really build that connection with that brand through the typeface choice. And so Apple's typeface choice was ITC Garamond. And they ran with that for a while. But then the iPhone dropped, and it would have been around the iPhone 3GS or the iPhone 4, where Apple, definitely with the iPhone 4, Apple was like, this is becoming a mainstream product. This is really going to take off, and we need to do something with this to sustain it. Um, and at that time, the iPhone was using Helvetica as its main typeface. Helvetica is the most ubiquitous font. It's everywhere. It's the typeface that works in every kind of environment, or some would argue it doesn't work in any environment. And it's just so kind of obvious in the way that it presents itself. And, many big typography names have argued that you can never fix Helvetica or change Helvetica. It's always going to be uh, returning to the original Helvetica. Helvetica was the final iteration of that typeface. And so the iPhone was using Helvetica, but the iPhone was small, And using Helvetica on the iPhone wasn't ideal. It didn't read, or it didn't have the readability or legibility that it really, um, in that environment on the iPhone, there was a real potential for certain kind of readability and legibility to happen. And they picked Helvetica, but Helvetica didn't really live up to that. And so they were stuck. You can't really redesign Helvetica, and the iPhone is taking off. And what do we do? And so it's kind of this perfect storm, right? Because they've got ITC Garamond, which is this terrible typeface that's so Apple. It became Apple Garamond. And then they have Helvetica on this product that is really taking off, that, Helvetica is not really suited for this product, the iPhone, but they're using Helvetica. And, there's a real kind of opportunity to step in with a new typeface and say, this will be Apple's umbrella typeface for all of our products and devices and services and packaging and marketing and everything. And they did that, and they created San Francisco. San Francisco was somewhat well received when it came out. It served its purpose. Its purpose, I think, one of its purposes was to look good on the iPhone. And, in many respects, it did the impossible. It was a kind of revisiting of Helvetica and a kind of tightening up of Helvetica for the iPhone. But Apple knew that it was going to use it across its products and services, quite possibly because they knew the iPhone was going to keep taking off at that point. And with the introduction of San Francisco on the screens of the iPhone, it might just be Apple's main typographic impetus at that point. And so San Francisco was born and San Francisco was adopted, and it became the Apple typeface. And, for me personally, I look at San Francisco and I look at the lowercase a, for example, and it just looks a little bit too round on the top. I would say it's probably diminishing a worse version of Helvetica. But different people will argue against that, of course. But San Francisco was adopted, and it was on the iPhone. And since it was on the iPhone and the iPhone kept taking off, it started to be everywhere. And so ITC Garamond was flushed away and was replaced with San Francisco, this Helvetica-esque font. And that was the big change. And in terms of brand refreshes, they got rid of ITC Garamond, a terrible thing, and they created a more legible, readable variation of Helvetica for the iPhone, this flagship product. So if there ever had to be a brand refresh, that was the time to do it, and it was a good time to do it. But it wasn't ideal in my eyes, because in my eyes, a brand refresh is never really ideal. Everyone has this strong association with ITC Garamond. They really like it, and they know it's Apple. And there's really no reason to let go of it, even if it's a terrible typeface. But Apple knew that with the iPhone taking off, that they would have to do this, and a brand refresh was the way to do it. And even more than a brand refresh, in this case, it was a typeface for all of Apple. And, that accompanied the switch from Apple computers to becoming just Apple, and San Francisco was everywhere. The argument I'm trying to make here is that even though it was a perfect storm and the ideal time for Apple to do something like that, it kind of pigeonholed Apple into being the iPhone brand now instead of this kind of all-encompassing brand. And, we're in late 2025 now, and all of Apple's products are great, but it's the iPhone that's the thing that almost only incrementally changes, almost doesn't change at all, and has just released itself over and over again over the years, and it's been years. And you know, why is that happening? If you're a typography connoisseur, you might argue that it's because of the San Francisco that's embedded in the iPhone, and that was part of the whole taking off of the iPhone. And that's what pigeonholed Apple into being the iPhone company. Many people will argue that, and that's a very controversial thing to say, I guess. But what they did was a brand refresh tied to a product that was front and center. And they're doing a big thing with the brand refresh because ITC Garamond is no longer going to be the memorable typeface. Now it's going to be San Francisco. And that shift was a shift that could never really happen again. I mean, if they were to do it again, it would be so dangerous. So now the association with Apple is with San Francisco, and that is the typeface of the company. And so they're kind of stuck with that. And because it's tied to the iPhone, they're stuck with the iPhone the way it is now, and they can't really change it. In terms of typography, which might be the most important part, at least in a residual way. So this is my first kind of critique of a brand refresh, and something that I want to tackle. I feel like it's a mainstream topic that people can kind of learn about fonts and be like, oh yeah, it's this subconscious thing. And Apple did it, and look at what happened there. And you might argue that it was because of it, or it wasn't because of it, or fonts are not that important, or they're really important. But the point is that Apple did it, and they did it at a very critical time, and it was a massive shift, and it was a successful one, and it really transformed the company. And I think it positioned them in a way that made the iPhone a central flagship device, and will continue to be that device. So that's all I wanted to say. So check back on this channel and on TYPECRITS. I'll be doing a critique every Monday, and uploading a new kind of typographic worldly decision that affected everything. So glad you're interested in type, and keep listening. Thanks so much.